and welcome back finally to a new episode of the S-Class. Today's topic is a very salient one for the moment, and it is flowers. As you might have realized if you went shopping for flowers, there are very many different types. So today we are going to try and understand how to categorize them and how to understand the difference between them. First of all, the main differentiation that we can make is where the flour is coming from. It could come from a grain like wheat or rice or corn. It could come from nuts like almonds. It could come from legumes like red lentils and peas. All of them have their own characteristics and their own purposes. Another important characteristic of flours is how strong it is, so what capacity it has to create a glutenic mesh. This mesh is the one that will then capture the gases inside of the dough and therefore allow leavenings. So the bubbles that we see inside are actually trapped air inside of this mesh. The stronger the flour, the higher our dough will rise. The less strong the flour, obviously, the flatter it will be. It is important to know that whole grain flours and flours that have a lot of fiber will have a reduced capacity to rise, and this is why, for example, a whole grain pizza is usually slightly lower than a white pizza. Inside, obviously, we will have many properties that are not present in white flours, and now we will see what the difference is between all these types. The flours that we find mainly, so the ones that we know best, are the ones from soft wheat. In every country there are different denominations for the different flours, but in general what they define is the type of fining of the flour. Here we have showcased some flours from Italy, from an organic mill called Antico Molino Rosso. They are one of my favorite mills in Italy, as they have a lab inside of the factory by which they test every single batch of grain coming in for residues. Therefore, they can ensure that every flour that leaves their factory is 100% organic. Also, they only do stone ground, which is an important characteristic as well, and now we will see why. Grains can be milled in different ways. Stone grinding them is known to be the best way because the stone does not heat up during the grinding of the grains, and therefore it leaves all the nutrients inside of the grains intact. With steel grinding, for example, you are able to reach a higher level of fining. This is why, for example, they don't sell 0-0 type flour, because you cannot achieve this through stone ground, but steel heats up much more than stone and therefore can ruin the nutrients inside of the grain. The differentiation between the flours is made by taking an amount of flour, burning it and measuring the ashes. And why that? Because the particles that burn are only the minerals contained in the flour. Therefore, the more it is refined, the less ashes it will produce. So no matter what country we are in and no matter what type of classification, we will always know how refined a flour is. I am going to show you how we differentiate them in Italy. So let's start from soft wheat, which is the most common type of flour and also the one that has the most degrees of fining. So we start from the 100% whole grain, which is this one. It contains all the part of the fiber, the wheat germ, and obviously the starches contained in the grain. Then after the whole grain, we have type 2. Type 2 is a semi-whole, which contains a good part of the fiber, and then the wheat germ. The wheat germ is very rich in nutrients, so ideally we always want it to be inside the flour. It is also very rich in fatty acids, and this part can go bad very easily. And this is the reason why some companies separate the white flour from the fiber, and then they re-add the fiber and call it brown. We have read about this scam quite often. The purpose of this is to remove the wheat germ and avoid that the flour can become rancid. Also, this increases the shelf life to a much longer period. Although fiber is very important, and I always say that it is, removing the wheat germ means removing a very important part of the grain. Then we have type 1, which is a step further of refining. It contains a little bit of the fiber and usually all of the wheat germ. It is a good compromise if you don't want to use fully whole grain, but you still want some of the nutrients to be contained inside of the flour. Then we have type 0. This is a completely white flour. It contains very, very little fiber, if any, and a lot of starches. It is a very strong flour compared to the others, and it will allow your dough to rise better. Then we have Manitoba. This is not an Italian flour. It is a type 0. It is refined, therefore, and it is a very, very strong flour. So it allows to have very high leavenings, like for example in croissants, or even it can be added to doughs to add extra strength. Then we have durum wheat, which in Italian is grano duro. Usually this is the type of flour that we use for pasta. When you find remilled semolina or rimacinata like this one is, then you can even use it for bread. Obviously you will have a crunchier and harder type of dough, and it is slightly more powdery. Then I have brought some rye flour. This in particular is whole grain. With this you usually make black bread, which is typical of northern countries. This one as well can be mixed with other flours to add more taste and more properties. Then we go on to gluten-free flours. Gluten-free flours usually come from grains which are naturally gluten-free, like for example rice, corn, buckwheat. Due to the absence of gluten, they are obviously less strong and they cannot create any glutenic mesh. This is why baking with them is not very easy, and people often have problems in managing to get the same results that you would get with normal flours. It is common to find mixes in gluten-free baking because every single gluten-free flour has some downsides, and when you make a mix, it is easier to make up for these downsides. You can also find flours, as I was saying, made from almond or coconut, and these are usually used in paleo baking or for keto recipes where you need to keep the carb count down, and these are produced in a slightly different manner. The fats are extracted and then the rest is milled. Obviously, with grains, we do not have such a high concentration of fats, and this process isn't necessary. Therefore, to conclude, which is the best type of flour? It depends. It depends what you need to do. It depends whether you want to include gluten in your diet, and it depends whether you are willing to give up a part of the fluffiness of your dough to have some properties left. If you want a very technically high and perfect and soft dough, then you will have to go for very refined flours. If you want it to be healthier, then you will go for a more type of whole grain flour. One thing which is important to remember is that pesticides usually are sprayed on the whole grain. Therefore, if you decide to go for a wholemeal flour, my personal suggestion is to choose organic. If the flour is white, you actually have less risk of contamination as the outer sides of the grains are removed. I hope this was helpful. I hope you enjoy your baking, and see you next time with a new video.